I was born in the year 1892 inches, the city of Philadelphia, in a narrow brick row house near the Delaware River. You ask me about the year 1918. You ask me about the silence. It is a strange thing to speak of silence in a city like Philadelphia. In my youth, this city was never silent. It was a place of iron and steam, a place that roared from dawn until midnight. We were the workshop of the world. We made the steel, the ships, and the locomotives. And when the Great War came to Europe, we made the weapons. The year 1918 did not begin with fear. It began with a fevered, frantic excitement. The war had been raging for 4 years, and the United States was finally in the fight. There was a patriotism in the air, thick enough to taste. Flags hung from every porch, stiff with coal dust, but bright with pride. Boys I had grown up with were donning khaki uniforms and marching off to training camps. We were told we were winning. I was 26 years old that year. I stood 6 feet tall and was broad from a life of labor, yet I had not gone to war. I tried to enlist in 1917, but the Army doctor rejected me. I had a deafness in my left ear from a childhood infection. I felt a burning shame about this. I walked the street seeing men in uniform, some half my strength, and felt less than them. I did not know then that the war was coming to me. I did not know the greatest killing field would not be in France, but right here on the cobblestones of South Philadelphia. I worked for the Energetic Ice Company, driving a team of 2 massive draft horses, delivering block ice to homes and businesses. It was brutal labor. The blocks weighed up to 100 pounds, and I carried them on my back with iron tongs. But I loved the work. It gave me a view of the city few men possessed. I went into the back doors of wealthy mansions on Rittenhouse Square, smelling roasting beef and perfume. I went into the crowded tenements of the Italian market, smelling garlic and damp plaster. I saw the city from the inside out. The summer was hot, a humid heat that settled over the valley like a wet wool blanket. But as September approached, the talk was of the Liberty Loan Drive. The government needed money to finish the war. Philadelphia planned the greatest parade the city had ever seen. I remember the date perfectly, September 28th, 1918, a Saturday. The newspapers had warned us, buried in the back pages, that there was sickness at the Navy Yard. Some sailors had come down with a bad grippe, but the officials told us there was no danger. They said fresh air and patriotism would keep us healthy. They did not want to look afraid. And so 200,000 people came out. 200,000 souls packed into the canyon of Broad Street. I was there with my ice wagon, standing on the wheel to get a look. It was a sea of humanity. Men in straw hats, women in Sunday best, children waving flags. The band played Over There, and the brass instruments gleamed like gold. It was a cacophony of joy. But looking back now, as a man of 96, I do not see the flags. I see the breath. I see the spit flying from the mouths of shouting men. I see shoulders rubbing against shoulders. I see the coughs. Just a few at first. A woman wiping her mouth with a lace handkerchief. A man sweating despite the cool breeze. We were packed like cattle, breathing each other's air, laughing while the invisible death moved among us. We were celebrating our own destruction. We were marching into a grave we had dug for ourselves. That night, the hospitals began to fill. 2 days later, the city began to die. It started as a whisper. A shop closed. A neighbor missing. But within a week, the whisper was a scream, and then the scream faded into that terrible, heavy silence. I continued to deliver ice. People needed it more than ever to pack around the burning bodies of their kin. I remember the first time I realized the world had ended. It was a Tuesday, the first week of October. I stopped at a boarding house on 4th Street run by Mrs. Gable, a stern woman who always scrubbed her steps. I knocked. No answer. I stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. The stove was cold. The air in the house was heavy, hot and still, carrying a smell I had never smelled before. A sweet, sickly smell, like musty flowers mixed with the copper tang of blood. I climbed the stairs. I found them in the bedrooms. Mrs. Gable was in her bed. She was dead. Her face was not white. It was blue. A dark, deep violet color, like a bruise, covering her face and ears. In the next room, a young dock worker was lying on the floor. He was alive, barely. He was coughing a wet, bubbling sound, and pink foam bubbled from his lips. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and tried to speak, but he couldn't form the words. He drowned. He drowned right there in front of me, on dry land, in his own fluids. I dropped my ice tongs. The heavy iron clattered against the floorboards, a jarring sound in that tomb of a house. The block of ice I had been carrying slid across the linoleum, melting rapidly into the blood-stained rug. I ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. I turned and I ran out of that house, stumbling down the hallway, bursting out the back door into the alleyway. I bent over the gutter and vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach. I wanted to run home to my mother's kitchen, to hide under my bed like a child. I wanted to wash the smell of that room out of my nose, but I got back on my wagon. That is the strange, terrible logic of duty. I had a wagon full of ice, and the ice was melting. So I flicked the reins, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the leather strips, and the horses, sensing my unease, broke into a nervous trot. I finished my route. I went from house to house, and everywhere I went, the shadow had arrived before me. By the end of the week, the doors were hung with mourning crepe, black ribbons for the old, white ribbons for the young. I drove down streets in Southwark where every third door wore a white ribbon. Entire blocks of white ribbons, fluttering in the autumn breeze, like surrender flags. The city was surrendering to the pestilence. The character of my work changed. Before, I was just a delivery man. Now, I was a savior. Women would run out to the curb when they heard the rumble of the wagon wheels, their hair wild and unpinned, their eyes red-rimmed. They held out crumpled dollar bills, jewelry, anything. Ice, please, they would whisper. He's burning up. He's on fire. The doctor won't come. I gave them what I had. I chipped the blocks into pieces. I saw hands reach out, hot, feverish hands that steamed when they touched the cold crystal. I saw mattresses dragged onto parlor floors. I saw basins filled with bloody water. And through it all, I kept moving. I told myself that if I kept moving, the sickness couldn't catch me. I walked home that evening through streets that had grown terrified. People crossed to the other side of the road to avoid passing me. Men held handkerchiefs soaked in camphor or vinegar over their faces. The trolleys were running empty, the conductors refusing to stop, the saloons were closed, the theaters were closed, the schools were closed, the great noisy engine of Philadelphia had simply shut off. I lived with my parents and my younger sister, Alice. Alice was 22. She worked at a textile mill in Kensington. She was full of life, full of plans. She had a beau, a soldier training at Camp Dix, and she talked of nothing but their wedding, planned for November. When I entered the house, I went straight to the scullery to scrub the smell of death off my skin with lye soap. My mother was in the kitchen. She looked at me, and she knew. Mothers always know. "Alice is home early," she said quietly. She felt a chill at the factory. My spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. "A chill?" "Just a chill," Mother said, but her hand trembled as she cut the bread. "Just the hard work. That's all." We ate in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint, rhythmic sound of coughing coming from Alice's room upstairs. A dry, hacking cough. Not bad. Not yet. But it was there. That night, I lay in my bed and listened to the city. Usually, you could hear the trolleys or foghorns. But that night, there was only the sound of ambulances. The bells, clang, clang, clang. They didn't stop all night. The next morning, the horror truly began. The system broke. A city relies on gears turning, doctors, undertakers, gravediggers. But the gears were sick. I went to work, but there was no ice. The plant had shut down. So I walked through my neighborhood, and I saw things no man should see. A woman sitting on her stoop rocking a dead infant because no one would come to take it. A man pushing a wheelbarrow with a sheet-wrapped bundle inside, taking his wife to the cemetery himself. The undertakers ran out of coffins in 3 days. I saw them stacking bodies in their garages. I saw a line of people outside the undertaker's shop on 2nd Street, shouting, banging on the door. "My boy is rotting in the parlor," a man screamed. "You promised me a box." The undertaker, weeping, shouted back, "I have no boxes. I have nothing." I returned home to a house that had become a fortress, yet the enemy was inside. Alice's condition had deteriorated with a speed that defied reason. This was the cruelty of the Spanish lady. It hunted the strong. It took Alice, who had never been sick a day in her life. It was as if her own vitality was the fuel the fire used to consume her. We sent for Dr. Morris. He had delivered Alice into this world 22 years earlier. He arrived late that night, his coat buttoned wrong, his eyes hollowed out like 2 burnt cinders. He didn't even have his bag. He walked into Alice's room, looked at her for a moment, and shook his head. She was sitting up in bed, gasping. You see, they couldn't lie down. If they lay down, the fluid in their lungs would shift, and they felt like they were drowning. So she sat there, propped up against the iron headboard, her chest heaving, her lips already turning that terrible shade of lavender. "Keep her warm," Dr. Morris said, his voice mechanical. "Give her water if she can swallow. Whiskey if you have it. It helps the heart." "That's it?" my mother asked, her hands gripping her apron so tight the knuckles were white. "No medicine? No pills?" Dr. Morris looked at my mother, and I saw a flash of anger in his eyes, not at her, but at the universe. "There is no medicine, Martha," he said softly. "I have seen 50 people today. I have signed 40 death certificates. I have nothing to give you but the truth. It is in God's hands now. He left without asking for payment. He walked out into the dark street to the next house, and the next, a specter haunting the living. We were left alone with the sound of her breathing. It wasn't a wheeze, it was a crackle, like someone crumpling stiff paper inside a box. The fluid was filling her lungs, rising inch by inch. We tried the old remedies. Desperation makes you superstitious. My mother sliced onions and placed them in bowls around the room, believing they would absorb the poisons from the air. The room smelled of sharp, stinging onions and the heavy, metallic scent of fever sweat. We rubbed her chest with camphor oil until the skin was red. We boiled water to make steam. We did everything, and we did nothing. Around midnight, the bleeding started. This was the horror that no one had warned us about. This wasn't just a chest cold. It destroyed the body from the inside. Alice suddenly sat forward, her eyes wide with panic, and blood began to pour from her nose. Not a trickle, but a gush, dark and thick. It soaked her nightgown. It soaked the sheets. My mother screamed, grabbing towels, trying to staunch it, but it wouldn't stop. Then blood appeared at the corners of her mouth, her ears. It was a nightmare made real. My beautiful sister, who had been laughing about her wedding dress 3 days ago, was dissolving before our eyes. She looked at me through the blood and the terror, and she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, the grip of a drowning woman. "Jimmy," she whispered. She called me Jimmy. I can't find the air. Where is the air?" "It's here, Alice." I lied, stroking her damp hair, my own hands shaking. "Just breathe slow. It's here." But it wasn't. The air was there, but her lungs were gone. They were filled with blood and froth. She was suffocating in a room full of oxygen. We sat with her through the long, terrifying hours of the night. The onions wilted in the bowls. The camphor smell grew stale. Outside, the city was dead silent, save for the occasional clatter of a wagon, the dead wagons beginning their rounds under the cover of darkness. At 4 a.m., the struggle stopped. It didn't end peacefully. It ended because her heart simply gave out under the strain. She slumped back against the pillows, her face stained dark, her hands finally relaxing their grip on the sheets. The silence that filled the room then was heavier than lead. It pressed down on us, choking us. My mother didn't cry. That is the thing I remember most. She didn't wail. She just stood up, walked to the window, and closed the curtains. Then she went to the basin, filled it with fresh water, and began to wash Alice's body. She washed the blood from her face. She combed her hair. She did it with a terrifying efficiency. "We have to dress her," Mother said, her voice devoid of any tone. "We have to dress her before she stiffens. Get her Sunday dress, James, the blue one." I fetched the dress. I helped my mother lift the body of my sister, so light, yet so impossibly heavy, and we dressed her. We laid her out on the bed, crossed her hands over her chest, and pulled the sheet up. Then we sat in the kitchen and waited for the dawn. We didn't speak. What was there to say? The world had ended in that bedroom upstairs. But the sun was coming up anyway. And with the sun came the terrible, practical question that thousands of families in Philadelphia were asking themselves that morning. What do we do with her? The sun rose on Wednesday morning, a pale, sickly disk, struggling to pierce the haze of coal smoke and river fog. It brought no warmth. It only brought the light, and with the light came the revelation of what the darkness had hidden. I stepped out onto the front stoop, my eyes burning from sleeplessness, and I saw that our tragedy was not unique. It was universal. On the porch across the street, the widow Henderson was sitting in a cane chair, staring at nothing. At her feet, wrapped in a colorful quilt, a quilt I had seen on her washing line 100 times, was the body of her husband. She had dragged him out there because the air inside the house had become unbreathable, or perhaps she was waiting for the wagon. Down the block, I saw another bundle on a stoop, and another. The neighborhood had turned its insides out. The dead were no longer private matters. They were public furniture, waiting for collection like bags of ash. I went back inside and told my mother I would go find a coffin. I promised her a proper burial for Alice. I was a fool. I was still thinking like a man from 1917, a man who believed in rules and customs. I did not yet understand that in 1918 the only rule was gravity. The bodies fall, and they stay where they fall until someone strong enough comes to move them. I walked to O'Leary's funeral home on 3rd Street. It was a place of quiet dignity, with velvet curtains and a polished brass knocker. Now, it looked like a fortress under siege. The windows were boarded up. A sign was nailed to the door, hand-painted in rough, angry red letters. No caskets. Closed. I pounded on the door. I shouted O'Leary's name. I heard movement inside, but no one answered. I wasn't alone. There were 3 other men on the sidewalk. Men like me, with hollow eyes and desperation in their posture. One of them, a burly dock worker whose face was streaked with tears and soot, was holding a wad of cash. "It's no use, Mac," he said, his voice cracking. "I offered him $500 for a pine box. He said he don't have the wood. He said he's stacking 'em in the bathtub." I left O'Leary's and went to the lumber yard down by the river. I thought I would build the box myself, but the yard was guarded by police. They stood at the gates with shotguns, their faces covered by gauze masks. They had commandeered the wood for the city. "Emergency measures," the officer told me. "Move along, son. There's no wood for you." I walked for hours. I saw things that have haunted my sleep for 70 years. I saw a trolley car rattle past, the bell clanging, but there were no passengers. The seats had been removed, and the car was piled high with plain pine boxes stacked like cordwood. A street car hearse. I saw a delivery truck rumbling over the cobblestones. The back was open, and I saw feet. Dozens of feet, sticking out from under a tarp. Bare feet. Stocking feet. The small, pale feet of children. They bounced with every pothole the truck hit. The sound of the city had changed. The roar of industry was gone. In its place was a new sound. The sound of hammers. Tap, 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 tap. Coming from backyards, from basements, from alleyways. It was the sound of a city burying itself. Men were breaking up furniture, tearing down fences, ripping up floorboards to build boxes. I returned home empty-handed. The shame burned hotter than the fever. I had promised a coffin, and I had failed. I walked into the kitchen, my head hung low. My mother was sitting by the stove. She looked at me, saw the failure, and simply pointed to the corner of the room. "The ice chest," she said. It was a large, sturdy oak box lined with zinc. It had been in our family for 20 years. "Empty it," she said. We dragged it into the backyard. I took my hammer and dismantled it. I pulled the nails with a screech of protesting metal. I stripped out the zinc lining, cutting my fingers on the sharp edges. I sawed the oak planks. I sanded the rough edges because I couldn't bear the thought of Alice getting a splinter, even now. It was a mad thought. But love makes you mad. I lined the bottom with her favorite quilt. When it was finished, it was heavy and rough. It looked like what it was, a desperate thing made by desperate hands. We carried Alice down the narrow stairs. Rigor mortis had set in. She was stiff, unyielding. We maneuvered her carefully, apologizing to her body every time we bumped the wall. We laid her in the box. My mother placed Alice's Bible in her hands and a locket with her soldier's picture around her neck. I nailed the heavy lid shut. Bang, bang, bang. The loudest sound I have ever heard. But we had nowhere to put it. We needed holy ground. We needed the cemetery. But how to get her there? We had no car. "I will take the wagon," I said. My mother looked at me. "The company wagon? That is theft, James." "Let him fire me," I said. "Half his horses are dead. He won't know." I walked to the stables under cover of darkness. The city was under a strange curfew of fear. I hitched up Bess, the old mare. "One last run, girl," I whispered. I drove back to the house. We loaded the box onto the bed of the wagon right where the ice blocks usually sat. The wood of her coffin scraped against the wet slats where the meltwater usually ran. My mother sat up front with me. My father sat in the back, his hand resting on the lid. We drove west toward Holy Cross Cemetery. It was a journey through hell. I do not use that word lightly. I was raised a Catholic, and I was taught that hell is a place of fire. But I learned that night that hell is a place you can visit while you are still breathing. We drove west toward the open ground of Yeadon where the cemetery lay. The gas lamps cast a sickly, yellow light that barely penetrated the fog. I saw things that night that changed the way I look at the world. We passed a truck stalled at an intersection, its engine smoking. The driver was slumped over the wheel, dead. In the back were bodies piled like firewood. The tailgate had come loose, and with every vibration of the idling engine, a limp arm or a leg would dangle, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. A policeman stood nearby, shouting through his mask at the dead driver to move along, hysteria creeping into his voice, until he realized there was no one left to obey him. We passed a priest walking down the middle of the street. He was stumbling as if drunk, though I knew it was exhaustion. He was reciting last rites to the air, to the dark windows where people were dying behind drawn shades. He looked at us as we passed, his eyes wild. He raised a trembling hand and blessed the ice wagon. He blessed the horses. He blessed the box in the back. When we reached the gates of Holy Cross, there was a traffic jam. Not of cars, but of wagons, carts, trucks, even wheelbarrows. A line of headlights and kerosene lanterns stretched for a quarter-mile. It looked like the entrance to a county fair, but there was no music, only the sound of weeping and the idling of truck engines. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the smell of wet wool and terror. We waited in line for 2 hours. The sun began to rise properly now, illuminating the scene in a gray, flat light. My mother sat beside me, rigid, staring straight ahead. She did not speak. She was focused entirely on the duty she had to perform. When we finally reached the gate, there were guards with shotguns. They weren't there to keep people out. They were there to stop the fights, to stop the men who were screaming that they had a right to bury their kin. "Ticket!" the guard barked. He wore a handkerchief over his face. "I don't have a ticket," I said. "I have my sister." "No ticket, no entry," he said. "The office is closed. You gotta go to the rectory downtown. We're full up." "The rectory is closed," I shouted. "Everyone is closed. She's been dead 2 days. I am not taking her back." He looked at the ice wagon. He saw the desperation in my mother's eyes. $5, he whispered. It was extortion. It was a sin. $5 was a week's wages. But I didn't care. I pulled a crumpled bill from my boot and shoved it into his hand. He stepped aside and waved us through. If the streets were hell, the cemetery was the abyss. The manicured lawns were gone. The paths were churned into deep mud by the trucks. And everywhere there were mounds of fresh, raw, red earth. It looked like a battlefield, but it was the sound that stopped my heart. It was a mechanical roar, a chugging, grinding noise that shook the ground. Chug, hiss, clank. We drove over a rise, and I saw it. A steam shovel, a massive industrial machine, tearing into the consecrated ground with iron teeth. It wasn't digging graves. It was digging a trench. A long, deep, jagged gash in the earth, 50 feet long, 10 feet deep. At the edge of the trench, men in rubber aprons were lifting the boxes and the bodies wrapped only in sheets and stacking them. 3 deep, 4 deep, shoulder to shoulder. "No," my mother whispered. She grabbed my arm. "No, James, not there, not in a ditch. She needs a plot." I stopped the wagon and ran to the foreman. "I want a plot," I told him, grabbing his sleeve. "I want a single grave. For Alice." He laughed a tired, broken laugh. "Look around you, son," he said, gesturing to a shed stacked to the ceiling with bodies. "The gravediggers are dead. The sexton is dead. The machine is all we have. It's the trench, or you take her home." I looked at my father. He was standing in the mud, staring at the steam shovel. He looked older than the mountains. "It's holy ground, Martha," he said softly. "God knows where she is. The dirt doesn't matter. She's not in the box anymore." My mother began to weep, a loud, wailing cry. But she nodded. She surrendered. We drove the wagon to the edge. 2 men in muddy overalls stepped forward. They didn't ask her name. They didn't offer a prayer. They just grabbed the rope handles I had fashioned. They swung the box out over the trench. I looked down. There were already a dozen coffins. Some mahogany, some pine, some just bundles. Alice's box, the oak of the ice chest, descended slowly. It bumped against a crate stamped fragile. It tilted, then settled. They stacked her on top of a stranger. "Move along," the foreman shouted. "Next." I wanted to jump in. I wanted to fight the machine, but my father pulled me back. We climbed back onto the ice wagon. As we drove away, the steam shovel roared again, dropping a massive load of wet clay into the trench. The sound of the dirt hitting the wood thump, thump, thump is a sound that has stayed in my ears for 70 years. It was the sound of a door closing on the world we used to know. The ride home was silent. We were empty husks, having left the best part of ourselves buried in the mud of Eden. My mother stared straight ahead, her hands folded, looking at nothing. She did not cry any more. She had spent her tears in the field. Now she was just enduring. We passed a newsstand on Broad Street. A boy was shouting, holding up a paper. "Germans retreat! Kaiser on the run! Peace coming! Read all about it!" Peace. The word sounded like a cruel joke in a language I no longer spoke. What did we care about the Kaiser? What did we care about the mustard gas in the Argonne? Our war was in the bedroom. Our trenches were in the backyard. The Germans hadn't killed Alice. The air had killed her. The very act of living in a city had killed her. I dropped my parents at the house. My mother went inside and closed the door. She didn't come out for 3 weeks. She sat in the chair by the window, waiting for a mistake to be corrected, waiting for Alice to come home. I did not go inside. I couldn't face the empty room upstairs. I had the wagon. I had the horse. And I had the ice. You might ask why I went back to work that day. You have to understand the logic of 1918. If you stopped moving, you died. Or worse, you started thinking. So I drove back to the plant. The foreman, Mr. Henderson, saw the mud on the wheels and the red in my eyes. He knew. He just pointed to the chute. "Load up, Jimmy," he said quietly. "They're screaming for it in Southwark. The hospitals are running dry." I loaded the blocks. The cold burned my back. It was good pain. It grounded me. I drove into the streets. October was the cruelest month. The leaves were turning gold, but no one looked up. Everyone wore masks now, gauze, cheesecloth, looking like bandits. I saw a man beaten on a trolley because he sneezed. Fear had stripped away our civility. We were animals strapped in a cage with a predator we couldn't see. They had turned schools and gyms into emergency hospitals. I was sent to a high school on Broad Street. I carried a 100-pound block on my shoulder through the doors where the basketball team used to run out. The smell hit me first. It was a physical blow. The smell of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and that terrible, sweet, metallic scent of the flu. It was so thick you could taste it, like licking a copper penny. Inside, the gym floor was covered in cots. Hundreds of them. The sound was not silence. It was a low, continuous moan, rasp, wheeze, 1,000 lungs struggling for air. A young nurse, her apron bloody, pointed to a tub. "Ice! Put it there! Break it up! Fast! The fever is spiking!" I smashed the block. On my 4th trip, I saw Father Doherty from my parish moving between the cots. He looked gaunt, his cassock stained. He wasn't giving last rites. There wasn't time. He was just touching foreheads, a mechanical blessing. "Father," I whispered. He looked at me with dry, tired eyes. "I have run out of oil, James," he said. "I have run out of holy water. I am blessing them with tap water now. Do you think God minds?" "No, Father," I said. "I don't think he minds." "I think God left Philadelphia on Tuesday," he said flatly. "And I don't blame him." As I left, I saw orderlies carrying a stretcher. It was the young nurse who had shouted at me 10 minutes ago. She had collapsed and died while I was unloading the wagon. Gone. Just like that. I ran out. I climbed onto the wagon and whipped Bess. "Go!" I screamed. I wanted to outrun the smell. I drove to the river and sat on the dock, watching the gray water. I lit a cigarette, my hands shaking. I dragged the smoke deep into my lungs, and then I felt it. It started as a tickle, a small scratch at the back of my throat. I swallowed. It was still there. Then a shiver. Not a cold shiver, but a hot vibration deep inside my bones. My lower back began to ache, a dull, throbbing pain. I froze. I stared at the cigarette. I knew the signs. It's me, I thought. It's my turn. I didn't panic. I just felt a heavy resignation. I flicked the cigarette into the water. "All right," I said. I drove home. I wanted to drown in a place that knew my name. I don't remember the drive. The horse brought me home. I tried to climb down, but my legs were made of lead. I fell, hitting the cobblestones hard. My father found me and dragged me into the kitchen. My mother looked down at me. She didn't look terrified. She looked like a general facing a new battle. "Get him up," she said. "Put him in Alice's bed. It's the only one with fresh sheets." I was put into the bed my sister had died in 3 days prior. I could still smell the camphor oil on the pillow. I was lying in her grave, waiting for the dirt to fall. For the next 4 days, I did not exist in the world of men. I existed in the world of the fever, a fugue state where time stopped being a line and became a terrifying circle. They say the temperature in the worst cases could rise to 105, even 106 degrees. At that heat, the brain boils. Reality melts at the edges like wax near a flame. I was not in Philadelphia anymore. I was in France. I was in the war I had been too deaf to join. The sound of my own heart beating against my ribs was the sound of heavy artillery. Thump, thump, thump. The cracks in the plaster ceiling above me transformed into the muddy trenches of the Western Front. I saw men coming out of the walls, their faces wrapped in gauze, reaching for me with muddy hands. I saw Alice. She was standing at the foot of the bed, wearing her blue Sunday dress, the one we had buried her in. But it was wet. It was soaking wet, dripping muddy water onto the floorboards. "It's cold, Jimmy," she said. Her voice wasn't scary. It was just sad, a hollow echo. "Move over. Make room for me." I tried to scream, to tell her to go back, to tell her that this was my bed now, but my throat was closed. It felt like I had swallowed broken glass. I could only lie there and burn. The pain was absolute. They used to call dengue fever breakbone fever. The Spanish lady was like that. It felt as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to my shins, my spine, my ribs. Every joint was filled with ground glass. On the third night, the crisis came. This was the moment where you either turned the corner or you went to the trench. The fluid in my lungs was rising. I was drowning. I remember struggling to sit up, gasping, my fingernails clawing at the mattress, ticking. I couldn't get air. The room was turning gray, the edges of my vision closing in. I began to cough. It was a convulsive, violent thing. And then I felt something tear inside my nose. The dam broke. Blood poured out of me, just like Alice. It gushed onto the pillow, warm and metallic. It choked me. I gagged, spitting red onto the sheets. I thought, this is it. This is the end. I am going to the trench. I looked at my mother. She was standing by the kerosene lamp. The light cast long shadows across her face. She looked ancient. She looked like a stone statue of grief. "Let me go," I tried to say, the blood bubbling in my mouth. "Ma, just let me go." But she wouldn't. She grabbed a towel, a rough kitchen towel, and she pressed it to my face. She pressed hard. She practically suffocated me with it. She leaned her weight onto me, pinning me to the mattress. "No," she hissed. Her voice was a growl. "Not you. You don't get to go. You hear me, James? You stay. You stay." She fought for me. She fought the angel of death with a kitchen towel and a stubborn will. She held me upright. She wiped the blood. She forced water between my lips. She bullied my heart into beating. Sometime before dawn, the heat broke. It snapped like a fever dream ending. I woke up soaked in cold sweat, shivering violently. But the air was entering my lungs. It wheezed. It rattled. But it went in. I opened my eyes. The gray fog was gone. The ghost of Alice was gone. My mother was asleep in the chair, the bloody towel still clutched in her hand. I lay there, hollowed out, scraped clean. I was a shell of a man, but I was a living shell. I listened. I waited for the sound of the wagons, but outside it was quiet. The frantic noise of the last week had settled into a dull, exhausted stillness. The city had burned itself out. The fire had passed over my house. It had taken the daughter, but it had spared the son. And lying there, I felt a terrible, crushing guilt. Why me? Why the deaf iceman? Why not Alice? Recovery was a slow, humiliating crawl. I was 26, but felt 80. My hair began to fall out in clumps. It happened to thousands of us. We were a city of bald, gaunt ghosts. My mother fed me broth. We never spoke of Alice. The name was gone from the house. On November 11th, the world turned upside down again. I was strong enough to sit on the stoop. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Whistles, bells, sirens. People ran into the streets shouting, "It's over! The armistice! The war is over!" I watched them. I saw neighbors who had buried their children a week ago banging pots and pans, laughing, waving flags. I tried to feel something, but I felt nothing. I felt cold. The celebration felt obscene. How could they dance when the earth and Holy Cross was still fresh? I realized then that people have a desperate need to forget. They grabbed the victory so they could ignore the plague. A week later, I went back to work. I walked to the ice plant. The gates were open, but the yard was quiet. I found Pop Miller, the hostler, sweeping the stalls. "Where's Henderson?" I asked. "Gone," Pop said. "Took the fever. Dead in 2 days." "What about the horses?" "Sold to the knackers, or died of neglect." I walked down the line. I found Bess. She was still there, starving in her stall. She nickered at me. I put my hand on her velvet nose. It was the only warm thing I had touched in a month. "I'm sorry, girl," I whispered. I walked home unemployed. I passed a schoolyard. The schools had reopened. I stopped to watch the children playing jump rope. I needed to see life. But what I saw chilled me. They were singing a rhyme. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. Influenza, Influenza. They were singing about the pestilence. They were turning the horror into a game. To me, it was the final insult. The monster was now a nursery rhyme. I walked away, feeling a deep, bitter anger. The Jimmy who drove the ice wagon was dead. He died in that bedroom with Alice. The man walking home was someone else, a ghost who forgot to die. The winter of 1919 was cold, but it was a clean, sharp cold. The fever was gone. The virus had burned through the population like a forest fire, leaving the rest of us scorched but standing. I found work at the shipyard, riveting steel plates in the freezing wind. I liked the noise. The riveting guns were loud enough to drown out everything. Rat-a-tat-tat. It was a wall of sound that kept the silence of the bedroom at bay. But as 1919 bled into 1920, I witnessed something even stranger than the plague itself. I witnessed the great forgetting. It was as if the entire city had entered into a secret pact to never speak of what had happened. We had buried 12,000 people in 6 weeks. Yet, by the summer of 1920, the crepe was gone. The masks were burned, and everyone was dancing. They wanted to drink bootleg gin and listen to frantic jazz. It was a reaction. We had stared into the abyss, and it was so terrifying that we turned our backs and ran toward the party. If you brought up the flu, people looked at you with pity and annoyance. It was considered morbid. They wiped it from the history books. In school, my nephews learned about the Argonne Forest, but not about the steam shovel at Holy Cross. It was a shameful secret, like a drunk uncle locked in the attic. I met my wife, Helen, in 1921. She was a waitress with a sadness in her eyes I recognized. It was the survivor's stare. We courted for 6 months, but never talked about 1918. It wasn't until the night before our wedding, sitting on her porch in the rain, that the dam broke. "Who did you lose, James?" she asked quietly. "My sister, Alice," I said. "And you?" "My first husband," she whispered. "And our baby. Both of them. Same week." I hadn't known she was married. She had buried a husband and child in a mass grave, put on her uniform, and went back to work. We held hands, 2 survivors in a city that had forgotten us. We got married. We had children. We named our daughter Alice. Life is a weed. It grows over the ruins. We survived the Depression and the next war, but the silence remained under the floorboards. I remember reading a magazine in 1950 about WWI. It had one paragraph about the epidemic. It called my sister a casualty on the home front. A footnote. I threw the magazine in the trash. America likes stories about winning. We don't like stories about people drowning in their own blood in a bedroom. There is no glory in that. I am 96 years old now. I am a relic. Helen is gone, the ice wagons are gone, but the older I get, the closer 1918 feels. I can tell you the exact shade of gray of the sky on the day we drove to the cemetery. I visit her sometimes. The trench is just a green field now. Children play frisbee over the bones of 1,000 people. I stand there and talk to her. I tell her about the life she missed. You missed the radio, Alice. You missed the moon landing. Doctors tell me now that it wouldn't happen today. They have antibiotics. That knowledge is a bitter stone in my throat. She died of bad timing. She died because she was born in 1896 instead of 1996. It makes you realize how fragile we are. We build skyscrapers, but a shift in the wind and we are back in the caves. People ask me for the lesson. They want something inspiring. But the lesson is dark. Nature is indifferent. It is a machine that eats life. We survive by stepping over the bodies and locking the doors. That is the price. You must kill the memory to keep living. Sometimes I take out the only thing I have left of her, the locket. My mother took it off her neck right before we closed the lid. It's a small gold heart with a picture of her soldier, Michael. He survived the war, married someone else, and lived a long life. But I hold that cold gold and remember the promise I made on the dock, to live for her, to breathe the air she couldn't. I tell this story now because I am the last witness. When I go, the smell of camphor finally fades. I want you to do something. Take a deep breath. Do it now. Fill your lungs. Feel the oxygen. It is sweet and free. You breathe 20,000 times a day and never think about it. But I think about it. That sound, the sound of breath, is the sound of victory. Don't take the boring days for granted. The days when nothing happens are the holy days. We prayed for those days in 1918. I am ready to go now. I hope I don't see the trench. I hope I see the kitchen on 4th Street. The sun is coming through the window. The kettle is whistling. My mother is cutting bread. And Alice is there. She is wearing her blue dress. She looks up, pink and healthy, and smiles. "You're late, Jimmy," she says. "Dinner's ready." And I will sit down, and I will take a breath. Alice Doherty, born 1896, died the 14th of October, 1918. They existed, they were real. My name is James Doherty. I was the Iceman. I carried the cold, but I tried to keep the warmth. That is all there is to say. The rest is silence.